Welcome to the Independent Thinking Show for Fifth Wrist Radio. This is a place dedicated to showcasing the great people doing interesting things in the world of horology. My name is Roman, and today I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Adam from Medium Watch. Hey Adam, how are you?
Very well, how are you?
Very, very well. It's been a little while since you and I have done a podcast, but you know, the dream team is back together, which is always nice.
It's been busy.
Yeah, and we have a super great guest joining us today. Really exciting. So he's someone who's very well known in the watch community, Mr. Eric Wind. Hello, Eric. Wonderful to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Roman and Adam.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. It's absolutely our pleasure. Look, Eric, what we usually do is we usually like to put the guest on the spot first thing. You will be well known to people, but maybe you can give us a little bit of an intro about, you know, yourself and how you fit into the glorious watch world, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. I am obviously a vintage watch dealer now, an expert. Have sort of had an interesting path from collector to writing for Hodinkee early on, just as a hobby. We were unpaid back in the day, and just pursued my passion, and then ended up getting offered a job at Christie's as vice president, senior specialist of watches. I loved that, had an amazing opportunity to travel the world, and then decided I would be best served starting my own company as a dealer and advisor to some collectors. So that's where I fit in right now.
That's fantastic. So we're really honored to have you here. Charlie was generous enough to introduce us, and we want to give him a shout out and thank him for the introduction.
Charlie's such an awesome part of the watch community. He's so passionate, and really I think he's really inspired a lot of people to become more interested in the details behind watches, and his enthusiasm is contagious. So it's really amazing to see that.
Oh, definitely.
And that's Books on Time for everyone at home. Books_on_time on Instagram.
And we have an old interview from a couple weeks back of Charlie as well, so you can learn more about him by listening to our show.
Awesome.
So we often start out by asking people what watch they're wearing. I know you've got so many options. So Eric, what did you pick today, if you picked something?
I picked a very interesting watch I just got. It's an Hermes watch from the 1930s in white gold, rectangular watch. I've never seen another quite like it. So that's my latest obsession.
Yeah, wow. I didn't know Hermes watches went back that far. I wonder who supplied the movement. Was it a Jaeger?
This one is a Tavan movement,
wow.
Which some people say Tavanes, but pretty interesting watch.
Very cool. And we might as well do a beverage check while you're there.
Exactly.
Might as well take that bit off.
It's more pretty early, morning here. I'm getting going with the workday, so I've got a double espresso and nursing.
That's very good. Well, whatever gets you going, if it's double espresso or double whiskey, there's no judgment on this show. So that.
And Roman, what about your end?
Well, my end, it's heading towards midnight here, so it's probably a little bit late for espresso, but not too early for a gin and tonic. So that's what I've got. On the wrist, I had to pick a watch that had an American connection because I'm joined by my guests, you guys, American. So I've got my Joshua Shapiro Infinity Series, number 6 from California.
That's fantastic. How long have you had it?
So Josh, I've had it for about 3 months now. So I it's been about 18 months in the making, but yeah, so it was good.
That's fantastic.
It's a fantastic watch.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's very nice. And I do enjoy that, that it's traveled the world. Even though I can't travel, the watch has sort of come to me during the COVID time. So it's kind of nice, once you sterilize it, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. What about you, Adam?
So I likewise have my eyes on the United States. I'm wearing a vintage Hamilton that I believe has a case that was manufactured in the U.S. It was kind of a transitional model when the company was moving to Switzerland. And on the beverage front, I have diversified. So in the past, I've been drinking cold coffee on these shows, and now I'm drinking hot coffee.
Oh, that's great.
The weather has changed.
And we should do a location check. Adam, you're in Boston.
Yeah.
Roman, what city are you in?
I'm in Melbourne.
Oh, great. And I'm in Palm Beach, Florida.
Oh, nice. So, I was going to ask this later in the interview, but maybe I'll ask this now. Why Florida? We've had a lot of discussion on the show about watchmakers that are in Australia, and a lot of them have spent part of their careers in Switzerland, and then for various reasons, they've decided to move to Australia, even though really a lot of the center of the action is in Switzerland, obviously. So, why Florida?
That was basically, it was a happy accident. After I was at Oxford doing an MBA in 2012 and 13, I ended up getting a job with a biofuel company in Florida that was turning tobacco into ethanol, biodiesel, and jet fuel. And now the company is sort of transitioned a little bit to be focused more on recycling of polyesters and other materials for the fashion industry. Kind of cool. The technology worked for that. But and Patagonia is an investor in some other companies. But I was working for them, and their headquarters was in Florida, so didn't expect to be moving to Florida before the age of 50. But sort of welcome change from the dreary but beautiful Oxford environment with a lot of rain. So we moved to Florida. Really, obviously enjoyed the weather. The cost of living is not as bad as New York City, and I actually worked for Christie's, but based in Florida. But given that I was traveling all the time, it really didn't matter exactly where you were located. So been in Florida ever since. We were a bit north of here, and then moved down to Palm Beach about a year and a half ago. And it's a little bit easier access to Miami, and we're happy. And it's very easy to get to New York pre-COVID, to fly direct from the Palm Beach airport, which is very nice and small, straight to New York. So I could get up there pretty frequently as needed. It's a convenient place, very business friendly, good tax structure, all those things that you think about when you own a business.
Yep, no state income taxes, right?
Yeah. And then school is, for Charlie, he goes to a great school here we're very happy with, and it's a fraction of the cost of what it would be in New York City. It'd probably be 3 times the cost at least. So that's also helpful.
Now, that's a different Charlie to the books on time, because that Charlie's already finished school. Just to get people.
Yeah,
you're not putting that Charlie through school.
Exactly. Not yet, anyways. But
he's not a dependent.
Yeah.
He's a tax deduction, but he's not a dependent. Got it.
Exactly. My Charlie is in first grade, and then we have a daughter who recently turned 2, and we are actually expecting another child.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. That's wonderful. Yeah, well done.
You have the exclusive news on that. I haven't told many people, so that's kind of
wow.
As long as your parents know, I'd hate for this to be.
Yeah, pretty much just immediate family. But now
that's wonderful.
Congratulations.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Well, when are you expecting?
In May.
So let me ask you, Eric. So your business, essentially, your business is trading vintage watches exclusively. Does geographic location actually matter now in the world of global e-commerce and things like that? Does it matter where you are?
It does a little bit. In a sense, it doesn't, because you can transfer, move things. The issue, of course, is tax. So customs duties around the world. I find. I know a number of European dealers, and I'm part of WhatsApp groups with all these dealers, multiple groups, and it's always the European dealers are like, I want this modern watch, but it has to be located in the EU. So it's just because it really does limit them, which is interesting. But the majority of my clients are in the US, but I do have clients around the world in Europe and Asia and the Middle East. But the vast majority of watches I sell are in the U.S.
That's interesting. Yeah, okay. Because I have often wondered, because I would imagine you being a very well-established dealer with stellar reputation and fantastic inventory, that clients would find you. I would have thought you'd have a global reach or more a wider network, but that's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people, clients just don't want to buy watches from outside of their country because they don't want to pay VAT and worry about customs. So that's a broader issue. Certain places like Hong Kong, they don't have to worry about
Yes,
that
of
because
course. Of course.
they are more open to buying from anywhere. But it is a primary concern for a lot of people, I feel like.
So does this give an advantage to dealers that are based in Asia to the extent, is the vintage watch market really primarily in Asia like the new watch market, or is it in other countries like the US and Europe? Because in new sales, it looks like most of the volume is China, Hong Kong, Japan.
Yeah, no, I think the vintage market there is still really nascent and not a lot of collectors. There's just a very small, in China, there's a very small number of that are serious. From what I see, there is a good group of vintage Rolex collectors. Of course, this group called the Vintage Rolex Asylum, based in Indonesia,
Mm.
um, and with members in Hong Kong. But that's not that big at the end of the day. There's something like the number of members is around 30. So that's not a ton of people. And I just find that most of my clients are in the US. And my feeling is, but it's of course skewed because I'm here, that the American market is the biggest vintage watch buying market.
Why do you think that is? Is that the knowledge or the appreciation of vintage hasn't percolated through the other markets yet?
I think so. I think, I think Hodinkee has really brought a lot of people into vintage watches the last decade. It certainly, that's what got me into it. Back in 2008, I came across it shortly after it started. And
Mm.
2 years later, I just began writing for them and never expected I'd be doing this as my job. But I think that impacted things. I think we have a tradition of kind of tool watches here and a real love for Rolex. A lot of people in this country, it's just such a well-known brand. A lot of people, I mean, I sell to a variety of people, but some people are doctors that obviously have the means to buy something and are getting their first sort of vintage watch. They like the look and are getting into it. And other people are pretty serious collectors. I think Italy has a lot of collectors as well, and probably a longer tradition of buying vintage watches, but they primarily buy only from Italian dealers, partially because if you ship anything there, there's a high likelihood it will get stolen. So it's very hard to do
Yes,
that.
yes, of course.
So I feel like that's a domestic market, and it's very interesting.
Are there different degrees of cultural acceptance of used objects?
I think so. That's one of the things when I talk to collectors in Asia, they think about things in a different way. I mean, we look at the object and are okay buying a vintage Submariner, maybe even if we don't know the original owner, but there is comments like, yeah, but you're buying a dead person's watch, and who was it that owned it, and things in a different way. Maybe a spiritual dimension to it. Why would you want to have a dead person's watch, or things like that? So that is something that, I think it's growing there, but very slowly. If it gets bigger there, the vintage watch market, I think it'll explode even more because there's so much buying power, and they are sort of consumer societies. Like mainland China, obviously they're massive for luxury. So if they really got into vintage watches, it would be. The reality is there's not that many great vintage watches out there. And right now I feel like there's a real global shortage of high quality vintage watches available. So if they start wanting to buy more of these, then prices will go astronomically high, I think.
Yeah, the supply can only shrink.
Yes, yeah. That's been sort of interesting because supply has really dwindled. The vintage watch market has been on fire since April. And I think people haven't necessarily seen that other than in the auctions. Everyone was like, whoa, these auctions in Geneva at Phillips, Christie, Sotheby's were crazy. That's what I was seeing in the market before then, obviously as as a buyer and seller, and you go to people and say, hey, that watch I sold you 2 years ago is worth 50% more. Would you want to sell it? And pretty much the answer is no. There really is a global shortage, I feel like, probably lead to an increase in prices.
It's nuts because I was like looking up, the 16570, I think that's up 25% in 6 months.
Yes.
The 18038 is up maybe 50% in 6 months.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What's going on?
Yeah. I mean, I think people have a little more time to pursue their hobbies. Obviously, that's been important. I'm on the phone all day, and I kind of need to limit it with people who want to learn more about watches, or or they're current collectors looking for things, or they just want to talk about watches because they don't have the outlet to go to get-togethers. A lot of pent up anxiousness, and I want to talk about watches with you. So I've got to be like, I've got work to do. I need to pack up my boxes for FedEx and do other stuff. Be on the phone all day. But that, I think that's part of it, and I do think that COVID, it's all interconnected. The modern market's tied to the vintage market, and the fact that supply is way down for companies like Rolex, obviously due to COVID and them being closed, will lead and is leading to price increases, which makes these neo-vintage models from the 80s, 90s, early 2000s more valuable because it's all related. They seem like a bargain compared to the new sub selling for $30K on the secondhand market. It is all tied together. I mean, now a reference 5513 from the 70s, that's under 20K USD looks like the greatest value when the new sub is selling for like 30K USD. I would take that every time over the new sub with a green bezel or black bezel. It doesn't matter. So,
yeah, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
The other part of it is in the U.S., we're undergoing this massive monetary expansion right now.
Yeah.
So we've got very low interest rates. Borrowing is cheap. People can potentially refinance their homes. There's less refinance other debts. Do you think that has any bearing on this, or people are just want to buy hard assets, and in that way they can better manage inflation? Do you think that's an element in all of this, that we're dealing with potentially a hyperinflation situation in the United States?
I do. I mean, the reality is if there's more money, possessions become more valuable. I think that's the case with real estate in very desirable areas. The market here in Palm Beach has been absolutely insane since June. Mostly due to Northeasterners wanting to leave New York. The schools down here were the private schools, which again are a fraction of the cost of New York elite schools, were overloaded. I mean, they got one school that's down here got 100 new families basically, and they're way beyond capacity basically, all from New York area. So and we're not talking about a big area here geographically. It was just a crazy expansion. And then hard assets are good. I mean, I've heard people talk about wanting portable wealth. So if crap hits the fan, if you will, they could grab their watches and diamonds and jewelry and hop on a jet and get out of here.
The only thing, though, is that the most valuable watches are probably the least liquid, I would imagine, because there's just fewer people who can buy them.
Yes. I mean, it just depends, though. If you're buying $50,000 watches, $100,000 watches, you can have a whole box of those, and they are pretty liquid. If you're buying $1 million watches, no, not quite so liquid, but they're not doing that. They like to have, some people like to have some hard assets. And as people have said, it's not trackable necessarily. It's not like a car, vintage car that you're paying, tax on every year or something. It's not so easy to get in your jet, or large paintings or things aren't exactly so easy to move around. But so that, I think that's a small part of it. And but there's just a lot of uncertainty. The gun sales are astronomical here in the U.S., and ammunition sales, you can't buy ammunition in the U.S. anymore because all spoken for and sells immediately. Gun stores are basically the equivalent of Rolex retailers. As soon as they get something in, it's all gone. Shipment's gone within a day. So it is. There definitely is a lot of uncertainty. But the reality is, if you have a quality assets, I don't care what field, whether we're talking about art or cars or real estate or even other collectible fields like sports cards, baseball cards, stamps, coins. I mean, there's more demand than there is supply. So I think, all these categories that probably have a bright future.
So let me ask you a question then, because a confession, I feel comfortable enough saying it. I'm not a vintage collector at all. So, my collecting is more about independent watchmakers and modern indies and, maybe indies from the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, yeah.
So my question was, looking at vintage watches, condition is paramount, isn't it? I mean, certainly I've heard you speak about, condition over rarity and things like that. So when you have a beautifully preserved, untouched, unpolished vintage watch that you, Eric, that you possess or that you manage to find and you find a buyer for it, does that watch essentially travel from your safe into that collector's safe until it moves again to the next owner or to an auction? Or do collectors actually wear them as such, as watches?
Typically, collectors do wear them, which is cool. And I think, like you enjoy them. A lot of people have told me since, COVID, working at home, they're not necessarily strapping on a watch, which is kind of funny. Some people are wearing more watches, and I talk to some clients who do 2 to 3 different watches a day. They just get bored, and then they go pick out another one and wear it for a few hours.
Yeah. What else am I going to do? That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. That's probably more me, but that's because I'm handling a lot of watches every day.
Sure.
I switch it up, but I think that's the case, but people are still, owning them. A lot of banks in the U.S. are still kind of closed or limited. So I think a lot of people have been buying safes and things or keeping things at home.
Sure.
So, I think the beautiful thing is, most of my clients want to wear their watches, and that's how I feel too. Those safe queens.
Well, I mean, that's great, because I think that actually makes, as a watch enthusiast and also somebody who collects things, whether it's art, books, watches or whatever, using them and enjoying them for their purpose is a wonderful thing. I just always use, whenever I open a auction catalog, whether it's Sotheby's, Antiquorum, whoever, there's always a bunch of double sealed Pateks and sealed, and they've clearly been made in early 2000s, and no one's touched them, right? And collectors who buy them for the reason that they are double sealed, and presumably they just go into a safe until the next sale or till the next divorce or something, where they have to liquidate assets again.
I'm very glad they ended that practice of selling those, because it kind of did ruin it, because you feel bad. I've sold a few double sealed watches and it just feels wrong. You're looking at it and like, I want to try this on my wrist.
Exactly.
I feel bad for the craftspeople. I've been to a number of the ateliers, and you see all these people working so hard to make nice watches. To just think that they sit around all day.
Exactly. Yeah, and then you can't, if you open it, you could potentially be losing 20% of the value. So,
Indeed. I mean, the other question I sort of had, and really to tap into your expertise, we've recently seen a number of sort of auctions or thematic auctions which kind of failed to land. I mean, there was a big vintage Hoyer themed auction that there was a, let's use the word bubble, about the next hottest thing was the vintage Hoyers, and there was an auction that with crazy estimates which didn't perform as well, and then the prices of vintage Hoyers certainly went down pretty steeply immediately following that. So I just wonder if you could comment on what your thoughts on kind of managing heritage and kind of managing the markets for these things.
The Hoyer thing was a real disappointment, because I still love Hoyers. I probably am one of the leading vintage Hoyer dealers. I really was one of my first passions when I got into vintage watches, and still is a primary passion. So that was, I think, a little bit of flying too close to the sun.
Mm.
The market got too hot. I think thematic auctions, I think in general, have been a negative recently, particularly when it's a single brand or single model. It didn't just happen to Hoyer. It
Seiko.
also, it also happened to the Daytona after the 2018 Daytona Ultimatum auction,
Right.
which was taking a superheated market post Paul Newman sale, and then just trying to, superheat it until there's an explosion. It's too overhyped. It was really bad. And those are both things I buy and sell and have some specialty in. So I don't like that. I like thematic auctions that are maybe about a category, many different brands, or, I think the category auction's better. Like the double signed auction to me was a much better auction because one, prices weren't so insane that it caused overheating of the market, and it had like pretty much every brand represented, which was fantastic, and is more about the history, and it did lead to prices going up over time, which should be a positive. The result of thematic auction shouldn't be a crashing of the market. It should be more interest and like growth in that market. So that's positive. I mean, I think it would be interesting. There have been so many different thematic auctions done. And I think there's efforts to maybe do an IWC auction, but again, I worry about overheating a market. Or Vacheron. The brands themselves want to do these because it brings attention, but I do worry about it not being done in the right way. I mean, imagine it would be very bad. The Journe market is, absolutely insane. But if there was a Journe thematic auction, it could kill the brand, because the expectations would be too high and it would superheat everything. And that's not, it'd be better to do sort of an independence auction, or I always thought it'd be interesting to do a military auction, although you have to do it in a sensitive way, obviously. I thought auctions based on decades would be cool, or on, shape watches that are rectangular or squares, things like that. And on, the Genta auction would be interesting, but I worry about superheating that market. Yeah.
So, do you see these watch auctions as just a subset of art auctions, or do you see them as different? So, I'm a collector of Bauhaus lithographs,
Cool.
in addition to being a watch collector.
That's awesome.
Does that operate the same way, or is that something that operates totally differently in terms of how you think about auctions, how the market works?
There's a lot of similarity, and that is still an approach. Basically, when you're coming up to do an auction, and this was done at Christie's, who I think has done art auctions better than anyone traditionally. When I was there, they would have these kind of themes that they would build upon to get property, and that's a little bit different than a watch auction, because people are sending you. It's like drinking from a fire hose, because we all have different clients. We're all getting cold leads that come into the email box every day. So, essentially it's a hodgepodge of things, but I did like to have something to focus on. Like, back in 2017, I thought the Hoyer market was heating up, and I thought, I was telling people this might be a good time to build a nice group of Hoyers. I think we had about 30 Hoyers in my last auction there, and it did really well. Everyone was very happy. Not everything sold, which is okay. Some Hoyers are not as desirable as others. People approach these things differently, but there's all this focus or whatever attention on a white glove auction, which means everything sold. I think that's not exactly the goal from my perspective and from the Christie's business side. Now, remember, people look at the auctions from a collector perspective, but the reality is they're being made in a business way. So Christie's target was actually, you want to have 85% sell through, because if you have 100% sell through, you have not taken enough risk and not made enough profit. And obviously, if it's lower than that, there's costs for every watch that is unsold. there's shipping costs, there's photography costs. You spend time writing about it, but if you're not taking risk, you're not making enough money. And to be honest, when Christie's did their internal estimates on profit as a department, watch department for Christie's versus Phillips, we estimated we made 10 times as much profit per year as them, even though, of course, they got the big headlines and some of the big pieces. They were just spending a lot more. And it was a different goal for them, I think, than Christie's, which was just to make money, in an ethical, responsible way, but it's a business. So, so it is interesting. I think there is a lot of similarity. I mean, we worked closely with the jewelry department, which they're a beast at Christie's. Raul Kadakia is a legend, the head of jewelry. They did, over 500 million a year in jewelry, and we would do, almost around 100 million total between auction, private sales, and online auction. But, they did the same thing. You're dealing with privates consigning things they inherited. You're dealing with, collectors that want to sell some pieces, and you're putting together an auction, and hopefully you get a really spectacular cover lot or a few cover lots that you can use to help attract more property that's maybe related to those, related in some way to that by brand or by stone or by type. It's same with watches. You have something, like a Daytona, maybe you can use that to get a few other Daytonas to put in a section together. That's how I approached it.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, there's never any shortage of Daytonas as far as I can tell. And once again, I'm not a Daytona collector, but
Yeah.
So how did you find transitioning from an auction house establishment organization to your own business? Is the skill set exactly transferable? Finding objects, attracting clients, finding buyers. It's just it's a much slimmer organizational structure.
It is different in one key. There's obviously a number of differences, but one key way it is different, and why there are very few people that have moved from the watch auction world to becoming dealers. I think I think part of it is, having the capital to buy and sell, but very specifically it is in auctions for watches, you are doing estimates, and obviously your goal is to get it as low as possible. As a dealer, you have fixed numbers. You have to buy something at a certain number or agree to consign it at a certain number and sell it at a certain number above that. And that comes down to knowing the market super precisely, because, you're not going to make money on every watch. Some you're lucky to get out whole. You take a shot and you think it's worth 20% more, but you try every possible buyer and you put it out there on your website and Instagram, and the buyer just doesn't come out of the woodwork. That's why I prefer to buy things where I pretty much know I've got a few people who want that watch that I can sell it to. Because it is like the majority of watches I sell don't make it on my website or Instagram. They just go off to a new home and everyone's happy. But that is a big difference. A lot of people cannot make that flex. And that is ultimately not about understanding prices so much as understanding buyers and depth of market. Because some of these markets are extremely thin. There's two people that might want the watch and both of them have it. And then you think because it sold for this much at auction, it should sell for that much again. But in fact, it's worth half of that. And then you really, really have to understand condition. And a lot of watch auction people are not. They're just putting low estimates and letting the market determine it. It's an easy game to put a laughably low estimate on things, which certain auction houses do, and just let people decide how high it goes. That's really easy to do. But really, most of the time you're competing against other people for watches. So you're going to lose every time if you offer too low. You absolutely will, because they've gone to a couple different places, or, say a watch walks into a watch retailer, someone wants to sell it, which is a great place to buy watches, because these are generally people that are privates, original families. They're walking to their local Rolex retailer, typically that retailer is going to offer it to a couple people and sell it for the best price. So you're blind competing against other dealers for that watch, and you're going to lose, unless you offer the right number.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oftentimes I'll get an email from someone, hey, I got this watch and I want to sell it. I inherited it, or I bought it 30 years ago, or something like that. And they usually aren't just emailing me; they've emailed a few people. So you have to give your best estimate and still be able to make money, obviously, after you get it.
Yeah, it's an interesting market. I think even with real estate too, some realtors brag that they sell everything within 12 hours, which of course just means they've somehow underpriced and created a bidding war. If they get a bidding war, and of course if they don't get a bidding war, then the house is burned.
Exactly.
And so it's an interesting problem when this happens, but happens in that market as well.
Definitely.
So before you were doing all this watch stuff, you were a consultant and you worked with a lot of CEOs and high net worth individuals on solving issues related to business, regulatory stuff, social issues. Do your clients now remind you of your clients then?
They do a little bit, and it was good training in some sense. But the big difference with that is, we worked for super busy people, like Angelina Jolie, Brad Pitt, others, Cher, and they're not. They don't have probably the collector mentality. They're just dealing with stuff and focused on other things. Whereas like my clients now are kind of hyper focused and hungry for knowledge about these specific things, and their lives are maybe a hair quieter than those people. But again, also high net worth with their own things. But I think a lot of the clients I deal with obviously have some wealth, but might not be super, super, super wealthy. Those people just almost don't care about collecting in the same way. And you can see that in like, no one says Bill Gates is necessarily an amazing collector, or Jeff Bezos or those super wealthy guys. They're dealing with other things, focused on their businesses and things like that. I think the big collect are not that kind of financial level. But if those guys did get into it, it could change, everything, obviously.
I've thought about that a lot, actually, because if you look at, the overall revenue from an entire auction, some of these guys could buy every lot.
Absolutely.
Very easily.
Yeah.
And it would be not much money. Why don't we have that happening? Why don't we see people essentially just say, I'll take it all, and having prices creep up accordingly? Because to me, it feels like that there isn't that much revenue in some of these things.
No, I know. That's the thing people don't realize. There was only one guy who used to go in and buy every lot in the auction, and it was this gentleman who bought the Graves Super Complication, which of course later sold for $24 million, just like the day or two after he died. It was this guy, Sheikh Saud bin Mohammed Al Thani of Qatar. And he would go in and apparently buy every lot in an auction at Sotheby's, particularly for some of the indigenous art or other things. And he got in trouble because he was using basically the state of Qatar card. And some of his siblings then got his father upset about it, and he was thrown in prison or something. I don't know the exact details, but it is online. And then later he died, sadly, at the age of 48. But and they had to sell the watch because he had all these debts with Sotheby's. But they basically realized after the fact he was a genius, and what he had been buying was very valuable. And he was smart to basically buy up a lot of things and these categories and he was buying quality. He wasn't just buying junk. He kind of knew and had a good eye and good advisors for what to get. So yeah, it is surprising that more people don't do that necessarily.
Essentially be diversifying their portfolio from currency to various tangibles.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Well, the problem with things like art, watches and things, the tastes are very cyclical, aren't they? So, I mean, in the past, Rolex bubble backs were the things to have, and now you couldn't sell them if you were giving them away with a Daytona.
They're coming
Oh, you heard it here first, people. They're coming back.
back. No, there are some collectors, and particularly in Asia, who go crazy for them. They can still command very high prices depending on condition. Same with princes, funnily enough. But yeah, no, in general, that they tastes do change, and I've seen that. Obviously, markets go up and down. Uh, it's important people realize that some things are not as valuable as they were in the past by any measure. And yeah, that's why it's good to have, I think, a diversified collection.
Mm.
I do. I find it a bit boring. Some collectors are just about vintage Rolex, and the world of watches is so big. You're really limiting yourself if you're only focused on that or just on some. It is can be very boring, and I think independents have really boomed because people are interested in expanding to other brands and stories and people and the personal connection and
Mm.
the collector communities. I find it gratifying to kind of move between different communities of enthusiasts, from vintage Rolex to Hoyer to Enicar to Patek. It's just neat having clients and being part of different conversations.
Interesting. Do you think there's been an increasing concentration of the brands people are liking because of the social media effect, or do you think there's been more access to long tail brands that were maybe underappreciated in the past, in recent months and years,
Yeah,
the last few years?
I think it is expanding overall, and you can even see that. Roman can speak to that more, but people getting excited about Daniel Roth watches from the past, or Roger Dubuis, or all these different things, and I think it's true with vintage watches too. There's there's definitely many new brands emerging, people wanting things from other brands, different models they hadn't thought about before. The collector of Patek Philippe and the Nautilus likes Genta and made by Universal Genève, and the Pull Routers watches have really expanded in value, for instance. And the relationship between Patek Philippe and Universal Genève in the U.S. with the Henri Stern Watch Agency, that's really cool. And obviously Omega and Rolex, things like that. There's obviously kind of a connection there between the types of watches they were making and types of things they were being used for, exploration and really serious tool watches. So yeah, I think it's I see all these brands that are emerging. Aquastar, a few people cared about them before, and now there's a real hardcore group of people. I love them. Obviously, Enicar, as I mentioned before. All these different brands, Fortis, and on the independent side, I think A Collected Man has done a good job highlighting different independent watchmakers that people didn't know about or care about in the past, and there's a lot more knowledge dissemination now.
So much change.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So do you think, Eric, do you think it's there is an opportunity or a need for dealers who are also passionate about watches like yourselves to actually educate the consumers, rather to collectors, rather than sort of have a very transactional relationship? Because the dealers I see who tend to do really well and who are well known actually do that really, really well.
It's true. Yeah, that's critical. And I think that's true in any field, particularly art and cars. You have to educate people, otherwise that's how people really get into it and want to buy more and go deeper. I think the old school approach, which I see because there's a lot of vintage watch dealers I know have been doing it since the 1980s, is just be as opaque as possible about the watch's condition and background, and just sell it for as high a price as possible with as few words as possible. And some people still try to do that, and I think that doesn't work now in the age of the internet. It's too easy to find information and too easy to go find other people that are selling something. And that's one thing I don't love about the modern watch market. I do buy and sell modern watches occasionally, but there's no reason. There's so many of them out there of any given model, and the only the only differentiating factor is one, making sure you're buying something that's real and not stolen. Otherwise, it's just a price game, because I have nothing more to add if I'm selling you a 5711 versus any other dealer. I can't, of course, I can educate you about the history of the model, but like you can get that
Yeah, that's
online.
right.
To what extent do you think dealers make markets? So there's this whole educational component to selling, and there may actually not, or at least initially, be much demand for a particular product. Do you think that there's potential for dealers to actually build a market or strengthen a market where one didn't exist?
Yes, absolutely. And I think A Collected Man is a good example of that, because they've highlighted all these different independent watchmakers, and they have built markets for a lot of different independent makers. And I think the independent collecting community probably owes them, a debt of gratitude, because it wasn't easy to sell a lot of these modern, independent watchmakers pre-owned, because there was no market and no place to sell them or see what prices are at. And then they kind of helped. I think they're probably one of the top 5 reasons Shorn has gone crazy. Values of those watches. I think it's probably due to them, and then it allows other people to get in the void, and you've obviously seen other companies like Watchbox, which is from Govberg, or European Watch Company, and others on Chrono 24 that then also step into that arena, and that's part of it. And I think we've seen vintage dealers that have really helped propel vintage Cartier watches by showing them and talking about them and educating, because there hasn't been a lot of scholarship about them and the differences, and that's really allowed those markets to take off. John Reardon, my former boss at Christie's, with Collectability, which is focused exclusively on Patek Philippe. I mean, he's made the ellipse market, and
I hold one.
that's great. So it's gone up in value since he started that company. But he's educated people and shared his enthusiasm and passion for different things, and that is making the market.
And I can certainly relate to the comment you made about the independents. I mean, that's certainly true. I mean, A Collected Man doing stuff in London. In the US, you guys have, you've got Steve Halleck at TikToking, and there's Tim Jackson in California, who's been championing independent watchmakers for a long time as well. One of the questions I was going to ask you was about specialization. So, so when I got into watches in the early 2000s, you didn't have Patek specific dealers. You just had a vintage watch dealer, and they had Rolexes and everything. Whereas what I'm seeing now is more of that. This particular vintage dealer specializes in insert brand or model. Do you need to do that now do you have to carve out a niche for yourself as a vintage watch dealer now, do you think? Or can you still be broad?
Yeah, and what are the market segments? Are you all competing with each other, or really are there multiple sub-industries of vintage?
No, I think there's multiple sub-industries. There are people that focus more on kind of the blingy watches and the dress watches and brands. I think the Gruenbergs, who have the Keystone, focus a lot more on sort of, more of the dressy watches. I think it reflects they go back to the 1980s in LA. So a lot of Cartier and Piaget and Vacheron and things like that, I don't sell as many of those, because I find the market, at least among my collector group, is not as into that. They're more into steel watches, chronographs, sport watches, I would say kind of more mainstream Hodinkee-like tastes, if you will. Although I still sell some of those things too, and the occasional pocket watch, and it's a positive thing. The experience at Christie's, it was kind of like super graduate school, because you got to handle so many different things you wouldn't typically do as a dealer every auction, and you got to meet the collectors and work with my colleagues on the team that were more experts on, say, pocket watches or ladies' watches and things, talk to them about what their clients are looking for, and meet the clients and work to sell those pieces. So that was a fantastic experience, and allows me to flex into all different sort of categories. But yeah, some dealers focus more on certain things. than others.
And in what ways do you think you shape the collecting community, or sort of a dealer shapes a collecting community that they serve, or the collective community finds the dealer or shapes the dealer that, so the stuff that you're selling or you're sourcing for people, are you doing it because that's what appeals to you and then you've built a collecting group around you? Or did you find when you were starting out, you sort of put feelers out that, well, what do you guys want, or girls? What do you people want? And I will go and source them for you.
Yeah, it's some of both. You can't just focus on things that no one
Yes.
loves, obviously, otherwise
Sure.
you're never going to be able to sell them. And that I've got a group of watches I'm selling at any time, and some things are things I bought more because I love them, and other things I bought because I know I can sell it. Like a vintage sub or a vintage GMT. Those are pretty easy to sell if you have a watch in the right, nice condition. But then you buy maybe an Enicar or an IWC or something else if you see it, if it's really nice, and maybe you have to educate and work a little harder to find a buyer for it. But I think ways I've tried and maybe have shaped the collecting community a little bit is there's obviously more of a push toward originality, which I was part of that push, wanting things more original, untouched. I like unpolished watches, and it's somewhat controversial because some collectors say you shouldn't use that term. You should just say crisp case or bevels present because we don't know if it's polished or not. And obviously some watches are kind of in a gray area. There's a lot of people that use the term sleeve polished now because the watch is worn, and decades of wear can polish a watch just through wearing through your hands, rubbing against it, and shirt cuffs and everything else. But and some people would take a cloth to their watch and kind of rub it over time. Well, if you do that over the course of decades, that will polish the watch. That push toward originality is what I love, rather than something that looks brand new and is freshly recut and polished. If you want that look, just go buy a new watch. It's my opinion. And I like something that looks honest and coherent and rugged. And I like things with patina that tell a story, and I like wearing a watch like that because if it has some scratches on it, if you're wearing it, you don't need to worry about it as much. If you're wearing a new old stock mint watch and you scratch it, you want to jump off a bridge. And I just don't like that feeling, or I just don't like that about new watches.
Yeah.
So I think they're tools. I like to wear them. Obviously, I'm not hard on them, but, even your shirt cuff can cause like little swirling on a watch. If you're, or on on whatever, just wearing it or putting it, resting your hand on your desk or something like that, scratch a clasp. But I like a watch where you don't have to worry about that as much. So I think that's one thing. That the other way that I've hopefully shaped the market a little bit is that I had a diatribe against birth year watches in my talk to the Horological Society of New York.
I remember that.
Oh, yes, I heard
last
that.
year. And I said, they're not cool. It's lame. Focus on the watch, rather than this arbitrary thing about it may have been made in your birth year, because we don't even really know in most cases when it was made or sold or assembled. So, I feel like that has had an effect over the last year and a half. At that time, I was getting probably as many as 5 emails a day from people asking me for a birth year sub or GMT or date just or whatever. And that has trickled to almost nothing, which I'm very happy about.
Yeah, but also keep in mind, the watch collectors are getting younger and younger, and, the really young ones are still waiting for their birth year Rolex from.
Exactly.
That won't be on the list for a few more years.
Exactly.
I mean, and the concept of sort of the honestly worn tool watch, I mean, really appeals to me. But I wonder whether we're seeing the end of that era, because the Rolex that used to cost $300 or 2 months salary and was worn every day by a technician, whoever it was, TV repairman or whatever, is now become a luxury item that I've seen guys who don't move their left arm. They walk sort of in sort of like they've had a stroke
Yes.
because they don't want to, rub that watch against, So will that, because they're sort of wearing it as if they're not wearing it, so as not to preserve value. And I just wonder whether the vintage dealers of in 15, 20 years time, it'll be a much easier job for them to find, crisp cases because they would have been worn so lovingly.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like, that's why I think that 50s to 70s era of, tool watches will always be collectible, because I just had a similar question from someone yesterday. Are the watches today, should I just buy modern Rolexes and put them away for decades? And I said, well, a lot of people are. I know someone who bought a safe load of modern Rolexes, and it's like, these are going to be really valuable one day. But that's pretty unlikely, because we saw that happen with sports cards.
Beanie Babies.
Exactly. But, everyone in the 1990s, when the old cards got very valuable, had the same idea. So there's tons of boxes of these cards from the 90s that are worthless, essentially, because there's so many of them, whereas no one was collecting these things in the 50s. At the time of Mickey Mantle, people weren't like, oh, Mickey Mantle's going to be great, let me buy this Topps card in 1952 and then put it away. It just didn't happen. Or same with Honus Wagner in 1911 and his T206. That didn't happen. So then it was the same with Rolex. Pretty much people bought them and wore them, so they were not put away. They're not new old stock, whereas there are a ton of new old stock Rolex watches from the last 20 years that people are speculating on, but it's, I think, unlikely to lead anywhere significant anyways.
Interesting. How do you see this market evolving over time? What are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats going forward? As you give a SWOT analysis back at HSNY, and things have evolved perhaps. Where would you be today, and is your SWOT today different than your SWOT a year ago?
Yeah, I gave another presentation since then, and I even did a SWOT analysis for each brand with watches. So for collecting vintage Patek Philippe, their strengths are obviously their heritage strength. They're an independent company, so Richemont's not going to burn them to the ground. Like pumping out production, they don't seem to have huge financial pressures. Their weaknesses on the vintage side are most of their watches are obviously more formal, yellow gold primarily, a lot of strap watches, which are everyone now wants bracelet watches is the general feeling. So, the idea of wearing a yellow gold watch on a shiny black leather strap is not exactly the in thing at the moment. But the opportunities are, China and India love yellow gold watches, and those markets, if they wake up, there's so much wealth there, and they are waking up. I mean, a lot of serious Patek Philippe wristwatch collectors in China. It's a small group of maybe less than 50, but with huge money. So they buy those watches when they're in amazing condition at auction or from dealers. And same, there's a few in India, but I feel like that market, it could explode as well. And then, threats are, I guess if the Stern family sells the company one day, or a big chunk of it, will the next owner want to increase production? Is that, that they were apparently not thrilled when the Paul Newman sold for $17.8 million and beat their $11 million 1518 in steel as most expensive wristwatch, and they're like, we've got to beat that. Now they retook it, but with a modern watch, obviously an only watch, the Grandmaster chime in steel. But it's that is a threat. I feel like vintage Rolex, or just the vintage sport watches versus traditionally they're more formal watches. So yeah, I mean, and then in the vintage watch community overall, strengths are, these are very small, very easy to maintain. Generally, the last hundreds of years, a lot easier to maintain and store and transport than cars or art necessarily, things like that. The weaknesses are, I think, grading, if you will. There's not really a way to grade them except by understanding it in detail. Grading like for PSA, for cards or coin grading, things like that. That could cause an explosion in values, but also could have negative effects of people sealing up these things, which we already talked about is not good and
Yeah.
away. So that wouldn't necessarily be good. And weaknesses are sometimes understanding condition if things have been swapped around or altered, because they are kind of mechanical objects, and people can alter or relume or do things to try to deceive about whether it's original or not. I think opportunities obviously are emerging markets, China, India, and even just people in the US becoming more broadly aware about these things. And that obviously happened with independence as well, a lot more broad awareness about them and interest and scholarship. So, we want to increase scholarship always for all of these watches, and that's proliferating. Instagram, lots of blogs, things like that. Then threats, I think, are just more high profile lawsuits against dealers or auction houses, or that feeling, if that permeates, that it's too risky a field to buy, or there's no one trusted, or those sorts of things, or if it becomes unfashionable. And I don't see the Apple Watch as a big threat. I think but it is. There's no doubt it's at least some tiny threat. Wearables, whether people want to wear vintage watches or just exclusively wearable things like that.
And all those John Mayer incidents, I guess, got resolved, but nonetheless, it was something that involved a lawsuit.
Yeah, there definitely are lawsuits that go around, and I think it's. I think it's important people know you do have to be careful, and that's the case with any watches. I mean, people buy new fake watches, all the time because they just think you can go and buy that from anyone and anywhere, and that's not the case. So you do have to buy the seller and do your homework. So that's I think important. I don't think it's good to give everyone a hunky-dory view about anything that you can just go buy anything anywhere. And I know people bought independent watches from sketchy places that might be real, but it was stolen, or doesn't have original box and papers, but they don't realize the importance of that and value, so they're paying basically full price. But when they want to sell it, it's almost impossible. So you do have to do your homework and hopefully work with someone who educates you. And that was something I thought I don't like about what I see at many auction houses today. Is the specialists are just salespeople, because ultimately they represent the seller and they're trying to get as high a price as possible. So they're just push. What do you think about that? Buy it. What do you think about that? Buy it. What do you think about that? Like, they're not educating you. Well, this is good, but
Sure.
not the best. And that's something I tried to do, and I saw successful people do. And obviously you can become a dealer because you're credible and have clients that trust you, versus just sell.
There does seem to be that gap in the market that is certainly filled in the art market with things like advisors, that you could pay someone who knows the subject matter to actually advise you as a buyer who has money but no knowledge.
Yes.
But wants to invest in a particular asset.
Yeah.
Like, that seems to be a gap.
There's a huge gap. And when I launched Win Vintage, I thought that would be a bigger part of what I did, because, when I was at Christie's, people would ask me when I was in Geneva, can you go over to this auction house and look at this watch for me? Do that. I mean, you couldn't get paid for that. Obviously, it wouldn't be allowed. But two, there was no time because I was so busy focused on our own previews and working on selling our watches. So I would do it a little bit, but then you get a cold shoulder from the other auction house because it's such a competitive field.
Yeah, sure.
Pure hatred for each other. So that was, I thought, okay, I can do this more if I'm on my own, and like that can be a stream of income. And it is a little bit. I do some, but it's very little. I thought it might be as much as 10% of my business doing advisory services, but it is almost nothing. It's like a few hours per year. And the reality is, I think people just aren't aren't used to doing that in this field, which is kind of stupid. You're just relying on the auction house who's selling it for their opinion. That's really silly, in my opinion, because they're obviously going to tell you it's amazing.
It's interesting.
All these collectors, they're not used to doing it, so they just run around asking dealers what they think. I see it happen in Geneva. And a lot of the time, obviously, the dealers may want to buy it themselves, or they know who the seller is and don't want it to do well, or they really want to push it, or it's their own watch and you happen to be asking them about it. I've seen that happen. I've seen that happen, and they're like, it's amazing, you should buy it, it's the nicest one. And then the person buys it and learns later they were the consignor. They were asking for the opinion.
Oh, that's terrible. Oh, goodness.
So it's funny, everyone's trying to get free information, but you can't really value that very well, in my opinion, because you really don't know. They're not motivated to tell you the truth. So I've seen it happen.
That's crazy.
I've seen people kill watches. You don't want that. It's wrong. It's fake. And then that person they were asking their opinion of bought it. That as well. So
wow,
yeah, it is. You can kind of take that free advice. It's really worthless.
Yeah, wow. Are there collectors now who are actually building a thematic collection? So when I say thematic, it doesn't have to be a particular brand. So it's somebody like, in America, had somebody like Seth Atwood who built the museum, the Time Museum.
Yes.
He spent his whole, or David Solomons, who accumulated the amazing collection of breguets,
yes,
in the 1920s. Are there collectors now who are actually, in essentially building private museums for themselves, so who would actually, doing it, not just chasing the hottest Rolex or the hottest whatever?
Yeah, there are some, which is awesome. People who are very private and want to develop a collection of great things across the spectrum, all different important watches from every brand, independence, vintage. That is fantastic. There are a few of those, but not a lot. And then you do have people that are just really focused on one brand, like, people that focus on Journe, or obviously people that focus on vintage Rolex or Patek Philippe, that are more focused on, chronographs. That's really their thing, or dive watches. But yeah, I think that does shape. Traditionally, that was collecting. You picked pre-internet, you picked what you kind of wanted to focus on, and focused on that brand, because scholarship was so minimal, and to really understand it, you had to focus on one thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say that Hodinkee and the talking watches sort of phenomenon helped. It did change collecting, and most watch collectors now want a mix of things, which wasn't the case 20 years ago. So now people want to have a Genta watch, whether it be a Nautilus or a Royal Oak, vintage Rolex, vintage Patek, maybe Independence, and an array of things, Cartier, things like that. So that has changed. They want to have a collection more like Ben Clymer himself, and people that he's had on who have a mix of things.
Got to catch them all.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So in art, there is a large role that museums play in creating taste and curating the market. And there are art advisors, art curators, also this huge role of nonprofits.
Yes.
People having tax benefits by donating works of art, having them on public display, public museums. I've been to a bunch of watch museums in Switzerland. I've never seen one in the US. Why do we not see watches treated as works of art and managed and curated and foundationed and non-profited in the same way as we see other art?
No, I think you made a very good point. I've thought about it in the past, and it is interesting. Even there's obviously a lot of similarity between collecting vintage cars and vintage watches. One thing is the question of whether they're art in general. We had this conversation at the first Dubai Watch Week back in 2015, and they asked John Goldberger, who's Oro Montanari is his real name, whether he thought they were objects of art or industry. And obviously he's kind of dedicated his life to watches and his collecting, scholarship, and books. And he said, industry, absolutely industry. And I was kind of shocked. I thought he'd say art, they're so beautiful. And
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's like industry. They're objects. They were tools. They're made interchangeable parts. They were really they're it's an object of a factory, sort of thing. Typically, they're not art. Art is totally different. Art is unique pieces from the mind of one creator, sort of thing. So that is interesting. But there's car museums everywhere. I mean,
Mm.
small towns, in Wisconsin, there's car museums. I think it just doesn't have, every young boy dreams of a fast car, basically in the U.S., and it's maybe not necessarily the case with watches and the culture here. There is a lot more appreciation for fine watches in Switzerland and Europe. It's a standard gift when you turn 18 or graduate from college, a nice watch, and that kind of gets people started on their way, and it's not necessarily the case here. I mean, I find New York has a very good watch culture, but where I grew up in Wisconsin, I mean, if you wore a Rolex around, people's eyes would probably bug out. It's just not something that's done. So, and that's a case in a lot of places. There's not really that sort of watch culture. So, yeah, I mean, I see it among classmates at Georgetown or Oxford. Not a lot had like a nice watch on their wrist or were into that at all. They're into it now a little bit because they see on my Facebook and Instagram posts, they asking me about watches, and they're like, I've been following this for years. Maybe I should buy something. So, following your posts. So that's good. We're trying to spread the love of watches even among classmates. But yeah, I think I would love to see it happen more. The Time Museum seemed like it was a pretty amazing place. I wish I could have visited it, and I think I would love to see more of that, promoted. Definitely.
So, Kurt Klaus built perpetual calendars that were designed to show the year for several centuries. Where do you think our watch collections might be in 200 years, and what can we do to make sure that there's a happy answer?
That's a great question. I think the beautiful thing is these things should be preserved a long time. If they're properly cared for, they will last a long time. So, I think just with watches as much as possible that are water resistant, try to maintain that water resistance so things don't get in, moisture, dust, anything like that. So I try to do that with the tool watches I sell. Because I have known people that have bought, say, vintage subs with glossy dials, and moisture got in and ruined the dial, and they lost tens of thousands of dollars of value. But they were buying it from a dealer who didn't sort of care to check that aspect of things, and they got on a plane, and then water droplets formed inside the crystal, and they were ready to jump out of the plane. So that is one thing, and I think the reality is these things are pretty easy to store and take good care of. It's not rocket science, so that's my feeling. You just keep them out of direct sunlight unless you're trying to get a tropical dial for some reason, and keep them in a relatively stable temperature environment and keep them dry, and it should be fine.
That's the same thing you do with your children. Keep them away from you.
Exactly.
You got to watch out for water.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, the water and sunlight. Don't let them have either. You have lots of watches passing through your hands, obviously weekly, daily, probably hourly, as far as we know, at least past your eyeballs, if not through your fingers. No. What have you got your eye on next? What are you actively looking for? If you're happy to share.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's exciting for me is continually finding new things to learn about, and I still get watches, probably once a month, where I am so excited to be buying something I can hardly sleep, and I'm literally checking the tracking of this item daily or multiple times a day. Where the heck is it now? And I can't sleep, and that happens, sometimes with Rolex, sometimes with other brands, Enicar, Cartier. A company I've really gotten into their vintage watches, there's very few out there as Breguet. I felt like the scholarship is very limited online. I read sort of all the Breguet books I could. There was this era called the Brown era, where
yes, George Brown.
George Brown took over the company, was basically given the company by the Breguet family, since he was an English watchmaker for them, and his 3 generations really preserved and serviced the old Breguets and made a very limited number of watches that were basically sold exclusively in France. And we're talking 300 to 400 pieces total between clocks, pocket watches, and wristwatches. Almost, almost all unique during that period, and very few wristwatches. And to me, they're absolutely grossly undervalued. I've bought a couple, and really, they're just very, very hard to find because they're so rare. And I think absolutely amazing quality and history. And I love that era. They basically sold the company in 1970. So I like anything up to 1970. Just amazingly beautiful watches, and very special.
Yeah, that was I think they sold to the Chaumet brothers, who then brought, I think, Daniel Roth into the brand to kind of make the modern Breguet as we know it.
Yeah, which is okay. But in the 70s, they made all kinds of funky things, dive watches that are clunky. They had a chrome-plated alarm that Philips sold, with unfinished movements, really kind of crap, but cool looking. But it doesn't excite me. The quality of the watches from up to 1970 was absolutely astounding and very artisanal and so rare. So I bought a time-only Breguet recently with a Pursue 260 movement, which of course Kari Voutilainen has used and others. Very well-regarded, incredibly beautiful movement, and it's one of only, as I can track, 3 stainless time-only made by Breguet, period. That's one.
Incredible. Wow.
What's cool about collecting them is they're the only company that, with their extracts from the archives, gives you the name of the original purchaser. So other companies have that, but they preserve it for sort of history, for privacy reasons, whatever. But they'll give you the name of the purchaser, and they're always sort of French high society or European aristocracy. Amazing. These people went in there and sought it out. It was kind of a best kept secret, I think, among the wealthiest Europeans at the time. So the one I bought was owned by a gentleman who was a famous sculptor and painter, and he even sculpted this massive relief that's in Rockefeller Center. That's basically gold.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
Yeah. And, I walk by it every day when I was working at Christie's and in New York. So it's pretty amazing to have his watch.
Must be Art Deco, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So what year would that be?
This was 1950s.
1950s. Wow. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. That was kind of the peak of their wristwatch production. They made.
Sure.
Not even a lot, but they made some dive watches, of course. Then they got the contract for the French Air Force, but
the 20s,
yeah. But I like the more dressy, complicated watches. They made some incredible ones in the 30s, retrograde perpetual calendars, and chronographs, and just amazing things.
Very cool. Yeah, that's amazing. Wow, that's a good one.
Yeah. By the way, what about you, Roman and Adam? What are you getting into now?
Well, you can go first, Adam.
Sure. So I spent a lot of time recently thinking about what I want to make. I put together my first watch, I guess, this summer. I redialed a watch a year or two ago. And now I'm thinking about if I want to make my own Guilloche watch, what it would look like, what sort of movement I want to base it on, what case availability is, and what case I want to put it in. So I guess I've been trying to show my own voice in this and build something of my own that's a piece unique to my own specifications.
That's awesome. I mean, I admire what you do with what you're doing with watches. I feel like if I started doing that, it'd be a slippery slope. I'd become obsessed, and it'd be maybe not good for my business. But yeah, it's amazing what you do. It's cool.
Thank you.
See, what I think, Eric, you would bring a huge amount of passion and knowledge to a watch design that is, shall we say diplomatically, not always present in the current watch. So I don't know, more passion and, more passionate people actually constructing new watches is not necessarily a bad thing.
No, I agree. Yeah, I agree. And if any manufacturers want to ask my opinion, I'll be happy to give it for free. But yeah, no.
Well, there you go. Perfect. No, that's very good. Well, actually, my next question was, how do people find you? And, what's the best way for them to reach you if they're looking for a specific piece or want to see what you have on offer? How do they get to you?
Yeah, I have a website, windvintage.com. You can write my assistant at info@windvintage.com, which I also see. It's tough because I get a lot of requests for crazy things, and I just can't, meet all the birthier watches for one. I'm not going to do that. but I get, I was thinking I probably got 40 people in a list looking for a 5513 from me. And the reality is I don't get a ton of them because they're not, I generally focus on watches with a kind of a clear history of provenance from the original owner or family. So not a volume player by any means, but, and then, I'm a very, very small little company. I don't have 5 people working for me or anything. So, yeah, but I mean, if people are looking for something specific, I can help. And people can reach me on Instagram at Eric M. Wind. I try to be helpful to everyone I can be as much as time allows.
Fantastic. Yeah. Just people use your manners, address, and because that's what I hear a lot from, I remember Adam and I had a conversation with Ronnie Madvani, and, he was sort of saying that, he's always happy to answer people, but just use your manners on Instagram.
Exactly.
I'm guessing they can ask you what it costs.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, look, as we start to wrap up, one of the things we do here as well is we usually ask our guests and ourselves a recommendation, whether it's an Instagram recommendation or some cultural point, but both for ourselves and for our listeners to sort of, expand their horizons and grow the passion, as it were. So I might reach out to you, Eric, and see, is there anybody or anything you could recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, culturally, broadly, I would recommend My Octopus Teacher from Netflix, which is an amazing documentary I just saw this week. Really amazing. Still thinking about it a few days later. But I guess in the watch world, I found this book, Time to Race by John Goldberger, that came out this summer. Really kind of fun and interesting to look at different watches related to racing. There's some amazing, I've got a whole wall of watch books here, but just some amazing books. I mean, the Audemars Piguet book that came out recently about their complicated watches, just spectacular to look through. It's kind of a mixture of the books they had done on their chiming, minute repeating watches, on chronographs and perpetual calendar or calendar watches. So that's really well recommended, I would say.
That's fantastic. I mean, horological books are a topic that we talk about relatively frequently on the show, and Adam and I have talked about it. Actually, when we had Charlie on the show, that's Books on Time, not your son, who we haven't interviewed yet.
Yeah,
he's on a future show.
Yeah, we'll play them in to the schedule.
That's right. Yeah. So Adam, Charlie, and I actually spoke about the importance of horological books in this current day and age of online content, which tends to be pictorial but very superficial. So that is still important to get books. So that's great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Roman, anything on your end that you want us to look at?
I've just got an Instagram account that I think would be worth follow. It's at Hewitt Gar. So it's HEWITGAR. Hewitt Gar. It's a collector, crazy cool indie stuff, Debethoons, F. Peugeons, selection of Rolex, but you can just feel free to scroll past those.
Dan Henry. It's got some Dan Henrys, which is great.
Yeah, that's right. So just a cool sort of collection, and like a really interesting mix of indies, which is what I care about, and Rolex, which I really don't care about, but other people do, which is good.
Yeah.
Enough there for everybody. No, that's about me. What about you, Adam?
I would recommend the Open Case Pack, which is a series of questions every Sunday. It's discussion, no photos, and I think always quite interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree.
That's brilliant. Well, look, I think we might wrap it up there. Thank you very much for joining us today. And Eric, thank you very much for coming on the show and giving us your insights. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It was an honor to be on here. Thank you, Roman and Adam.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Brilliant. And finally, the last thing we usually say is, with Fifth Wrist, we set this up as a platform by enthusiasts and for enthusiasts. So if you want to join us, contribute, write reviews, or even come on the podcast and have a chat with us, please get in touch. Follow Fifth Wrist on Facebook and Instagram, or on our website at fifthwrist.com. Like and subscribe to our podcast. Leave us a review. We try to read only the positive ones, but feel free to leave a negative one if you like as well. Follow me. I'm at Times Roman AU. Adam is at Medium Watch, and our guest Eric is at Eric M. Wind and windvintage.com. Thanks for joining us today, and stay on time.